like to welcome this evening Eliana Brown and Layne Knoche as they share lessons learned from the Red Oak Rain Garden. Eliana is the Red Oak Rain Garden Director. She's a water quality specialist with Illinois Indiana Sea Grant and Illinois Extension. She leads Extension's role in facilitating the Illinois Nutrient Loss Reduction Strategy. She has a master's degree in civil and environmental engineering and is a certified master gardener, lead AP, and NGICP. Layne Knoche is an outreach associate with Illinois Extension and is the Red Oak Rain Garden's landscape designer. He has a bachelor's degree in landscape architecture from the University of Illinois and is also a certified master gardener. Just for a little bit of background, the Red Oak Rain Garden is a 10,000 square foot landscape installation on the U of I campus. It soaks up rainwater and supports pollinators. And their talk is going to focus on their experience of designing and building it with lessons that perhaps you can even apply to your own project. Maybe you're going to start a rain garden. So welcome, Eliana and Layne. We're looking forward to this. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy, for that nice introduction. And thank you all so much for attending tonight. I believe I'm going to turn off my camera. Well, I'll do that in a slide or two. We'll keep it on for a bit. As Kathy mentioned, I have about 25 years of experience as a water quality professional. So I began as a water protection engineer. It was maybe about 10 years on the job when I learned about rain gardens, what they could do to help with flooding and improve water quality. So kind of in short, I'm a water person that has become a plant person.
Yeah, and I am an early career landscape designer, but really from a young age, like, I don't know, I was probably 7 when I planted my first native plant. So I've really been obsessed with plants for most of my life. And my coursework in landscape architecture at the University of Illinois introduced me to connections that exist between the land and plants and water. And really that connection has been reinforced over the past several years working with Eliana. So I guess you could say that I've become a plant person that has become obsessed with water.
So we collaborate on these extension outreach projects that beautify the land, help a butterfly or two while improving water issues. So I'm going to go ahead, turn off the camera here for mine, and then go on to our next slide here. There we are. Pictured here are some of our team members from this Red Oak Rain Garden, or as we affectionately call it, the RORG. Kate Gardner is our communication manager. There's Layne, and Tony Heath served as our project engineer, and Karen Folk is our lead master naturalist. I have a dual role. I'm also, as was mentioned, a master gardener, so I lead the project for that as well. So tonight, Layne and I will talk about these lessons learned when designing the RORG. I'm going to cover some design challenges that we faced at our garden, and Layne is going to cover what it was like to design the rain garden with maintenance in mind. And then at the end, we're going to give you some resources for working with native plants beautifully. And those resources came from our experience at the garden. So many of you probably already know what a rain garden is, but I'm going to go ahead and list it here just so that we'll all be on the same page. It's a shallow basin. I'm going to bring my cursor up in here. Here's the shallow basin that captures and infiltrates. So here it is capturing rainwater and then soaking into the ground. It's infiltrating the stormwater runoff and snow melt. helps mitigate the flooding, improves water quality, and of course we have those wonderful co-benefits of supporting pollinators and also human well-being. Kathy went over what the red oak rain garden is. I'm going to repeat it here, that it is a 10,000 square foot demonstration site on the campus of the University of Illinois, captures rainwater, reduces sidewalk flooding, provides wildlife habitat, and it educates campus and community about sustainable landscape design. It's an example of a living, learning laboratory that enhances the student experience. This is an overview of where we're located. This is a residence hall. We're kind of nestled between the residence hall and this parking lot for our health center. There's the garden. I'm going to point out a sidewalk along here. Now, this is if you cross Lincoln Avenue, this is where a lot of our student staff and faculty live. And as they come onto the campus, this is a pretty busy pedestrian thoroughfare. And then this is where the garden is. We have a sunny portion, and then there are two main trees. So the lessons learned that that we're really talking about are from a renovation that we did in 2019. But the garden was originally built back in 2006. At that time, Professor Tony Indris had a class, actually a few classes, that designed, arranged, and built the garden. I was new to facilities and services, actually new to the university at that time. And I had just heard about rain gardens, actually at a Wild Winds conference in Madison, Wisconsin. And I didn't know very much about them at the time, but I knew that we needed one. And so I wrote a request for proposals for the faculty to build one. And Professor Indris answered that. So I want to also just point out this slide that has a lot of rock that these students are doing some hard labor putting into a wheelbarrow. You can see it has been spread out over the garden. And just to let you know, actually, why don't you put it in the chat box? Just from this garden picture here, how much do you think that these rocks weigh? And I will tell you that it is in tons. So if you put it in the chat box, we will tell you later on in the presentation. So this picture is a really good example as to why we needed a renovation. To point out a few of the things here. Now, this is that pedestrian thoroughfare. That's how a person would be approaching the campus. And that's not really a great way to approach a campus, right? Because we see these overgrown shrubs. The rock that I showed in that prior picture is all under here, but this is really choked out by weeds. It was still functioning as a rain garden, but there was starting to see some puddling on the sidewalk again, and of course, aesthetically, it really needed some help. So the next photo is our after. This is after the renovation. It was the first season last year in 2020, and you can see it's just a much more inviting view, wider path, and greater sight lines. So this is the story of how we got from that to this, and Layne is going to show you far more beautiful photos of the garden with close-ups of the native plants that are in it. The first lesson learned I'm going to talk about is choosing your site carefully. I mentioned the sidewalk. So here is the sidewalk. This would be the pedestrian thoroughfare as people coming in. So not only would they have had a rainy day to contend with, but coming into campus, their feet would get wet, and that wasn't a great thing. Another thing that was happening at this site and we're talking about 2006 at this point, is that there is so much water along here. And this is the red oak that the garden is named after. If you know anything about red oaks, you know that they do not like to have wet feet. So this was not a great situation for that tree, not a great situation for people walking in. So something really needed to be done here. But I want to caution folks as we talk about this project that choosing a site for a rain garden where water is puddling is not always the best idea. It did work out well for this project, and the students that evaluated the site did infiltration tests, and it was going to be an okay thing to do. With a tree, we actually had kind of see the branches of this the sycamore tree, having a garden that you're going to be cutting under in order to shape the bowl under a tree requires the help of arborists, which is what we had. So it is it worked. This site worked out very well for us, but I would say if it were back in 2005, 2006 again, I might have tried to choose an easier site, a site that didn't have the tree roots to work around. But we have that, and that's actually ended up being a good thing for us in a lot of ways. But just choose your site carefully and give a lot of consideration to your site conditions. The second lesson is to consider foot traffic. So here on the left is the plan of the garden, the original plan of the garden. So this picture is back in 2009. So you all maybe have heard this term path of desire, and that's just literally what it is. It's where people want to walk. And so if you are a pedestrian coming along here and you need to get over here, you're going to walk right through that garden. And you can see that's exactly what people have done, just kind of walking back and through that. And here's the highlighting that, and here's a few more students about to come and do the right same thing. And I don't blame them. I went out there before our renovation to kind of look at this all again and kind of try to put myself in the mind of a maybe a student, and I would have wanted to do the same thing. So we needed as a design team to really consider that. The other thing to understand is that it was a really strong path of desire. You can see it didn't matter what time of year it was and whether anyone was going to be going through slush or ice or whatever. So we knew that this was something that really needed to be considered. There is another path of desire that was around the garden. There used to be a berm right next to that red oak, and people also walked along there. I am told that the berm was put in as from fill dirt from a project, so it also wasn't a really great thing for this tree to have that berm there. So this is our renovation plan, and a couple of things I want to point out on it is this bridge that's right in the middle here. So that's that one point. This was the vista that we saw with the students that would be coming through here. And so we wanted to give them a good defined way to get through the garden. Now you'll notice that it's going, a person would have to jog a little bit back and forth, but we really wanted to avoid the tree roots as much as possible. And this is also one of the shorter ways through there, so to keep our costs at minimum. Other thing I'll point out, this is where the berm was, and this is a sidewalk that's along that area. And here's an after photo. So the berm is gone, and here's the nice new sidewalk. And it's a bit of a thrill when I was out working in the garden and I after this was done, and I saw the first few students that were using it and doing what that we had hoped that they would do around the garden. This is a beautiful rendering that Layne did of the completed garden that shows the bridge and the mature garden. And I am extremely pleased to be able to show you the next slide. Well, I'll tell you the quick story before I show you the next slide. I'll make you wait for it just a little bit. This is a sustainably sourced wood for this bridge that was gifted to us by Allerton Park. And it was supposed to go in spring of 2020. As you all well know, lots of things got delayed in the spring of 2020, and this was one of them. So because of the pandemic, we had to wait one more year. And so you are the first group of people to see this. This bridge just was built literally just last week, and we couldn't be happier about it. Well, maybe I'm a little biased, but it's really pretty. One thing that you don't see in this photo is that there's cables that were installed shortly after this picture was taken. And those cables across the bridge allow a person that would be perhaps in a wheelchair to be able to see out through the garden. We actually asked a friend of a garden friend who's in a wheelchair to come help us make the garden go beyond ADA compliance, and that was one of the things that she advised that we should do. We also think it has that added benefit too of should you be on campus with your parents, if you're a small child, that a child would be able to see out of there too, instead of having boards across there. So just a few extra design considerations that we put in the garden, part of the considerations. Design lesson 3, designing with maintenance in mind. So, okay, I don't know if I didn't check the chat box. Layne, I don't know if you could see the chat box easier than I can. Can you tell me some of the numbers that people thought?
Sure. We've got 3 ton, 6, 5, 8. I think it's time to give the number, Eliana.
Okay, it's actually 60. There was 60 ton of rock in here, which is quite a lot, right? Okay, so this is what it looked like in the beginning, and it was just so clean and beautiful, but not really sustainable under 2 trees, including that sycamore that likes to drop a lot of limbs. And one of the things that we really wanted to do with this garden is not in order to maintain good water quality, was to not use herbicides if possible. And I don't know that it's really possible to keep something like this clean without using that. But even with the use of it, there still would have been a lot of debris. Back in the time that this garden was originally designed, that's when a lot of rain garden design was coming out of the Pacific Northwest, which is a rockier area and just more natural to have rocks in a rock-based design. For the Midwest, especially under a couple of trees, was not the thing for us, and really absolutely something where hindsight is 2020. You would have this was the way to design it at that time. So we're certainly not knocking the designers of that time, but it's definitely something that we learned that we were going to take into consideration with this renovation. We had to do a lot of work to get that 60 ton out, including really bringing the big pieces of equipment in there. There was this landscape fabric, and that would probably be the other thing that I would discourage the use of is landscape fabric. I mean, you do have to use it if you're using rock, and we do use a little bit of rock. There's a photo I'll show you where we use it, but throughout a whole garden, I'm not really a fan of landscape fabric throughout a whole garden. So instead, in the redesign, what we did in the sunny cell is do an over excavation where we added a soil mix, and this is the I'd say very much of the 2019 redesign design approach was using the mycorrhizal inoculant throughout the garden. And that is used to make sure, or to give the garden the best chance of having the infiltration rate that we would want to see. So that was our upgrade or new thing, fresh thing that was done with the design of this garden. And it has proven to be a good thing for the garden. We're getting very, very good infiltration rates. So this is that, just want to show, this is that same cell, this is the sunny cell, and this is now what it looks like planted. So I mentioned that there was just a little bit of rock. You know, we maybe should weigh it at some point, just tell you how much that one weighs, but I don't know. It's probably not very much. This is where the water comes in. And so that's why we have this rock here, is to decrease the erosion. And that, in my opinion, is the best use of rock, is to break up point source flow that would be coming in so that the soils don't erode. We also, you can't really see it, but there in this photo, but there is a pipe that goes under the sidewalk, and in the inlet and the outlet of that pipe, there's also a little bit of rock for that very same reason. Just going to note here that the garden is based on planting in a post-wild world, and I believe this is the point where I hand it over to Layne to talk about designing the plants.
Yeah. So Eliana did a wonderful job of covering a lot of the sort of engineering aspects of the garden, from the bridge to the sidewalks and even the engineered soils that we brought in. So for this portion of the presentation, I'm going to talk about designing with plants, and a lot of this is going to be a lot of this is covered in a wonderful book by Thomas Rainer and Claudia West, who Eliana just mentioned, called Planting in a Post-Wild World, up here in the top right corner. This is a fantastic book. If you have not checked it out, I would really recommend getting yourself a copy of this one. The rain garden would not be as successful as it has proven to be without the wonderful writings of Thomas Rainer and Claudia West in that book. So a lot of what they talk about is designing in layers, and that is for a wide range of reasons. And I will go through each of those. And let me see here. So the first layer that we're going to talk about today is called the ground cover layer. As you can see in this image, it's a fairly dense grouping of plants, fairly short in stature. And part of the reason for having this dense planting ties into designing with maintenance in mind. This dense carpet that this almost forms itself, it's like a green mulch. And as the plants mature and they fill in and form this green mulch, they help to suppress weed growth, which of course leads to fewer maintenance needs, especially long-term as the garden matures. And it's also really beautiful, as you'll see in the next couple of slides that I'll share. So again, you can use these ground covers for aesthetics. You can use them to form that green mulch. I like to use them for both. I think that creating that fairly dense cover of plants can be really beautiful. You can play with texture, you can play with color. Again, I'll show you some plants that I think do a really good job of that. Since you are doing a dense planting of them, you're going to need a lot. So at the Red Oak Rain Garden, 60 to 70% of it is actually ground cover plants. It is a lot of plants, and in a 10,000 square foot garden like ours, you're talking about using thousands of plants, but it's worth it in the end for sure. Again, these are going to be the fairly short plants in the garden. densely planted. You're looking at a lot of woodland sedges. I know a lot of you on this call today are probably familiar with some of our sedges. Most of them in the garden are actually planted 15 inches apart, which is where the thousands of plants come from, of course. And again, as they fill in and mature, they really form that green mulch. They also provide overwintering habitat for pollinators and so many other things. So here's what the ground cover looked like just the following spring after the renovation. So this is spring of 2020. And you can already see that the plants are really starting to fill in. A lot of these are sedges, rosy sedge and Pennsylvania sedge in particular. And I can tell you that as of this spring, you can't see these rows anymore. The sedges have really done a beautiful job of filling in, and our weeding needs have not entirely been eliminated by any means, but the weeding has been decreased substantially from the success of the ground cover layer. So I like to say that this is my first overwhelming slide, but I will tell you now that we have a comprehensive plant list, plant selection on our website. And Eliana, I'm not sure if you could put that into the chat box while I'm talking here, but we do have all of these plants within our website. These are just our ground cover species, but from this you can see that there's a pretty wide variety of plants that can be categorized into this ground cover layer. Things like wild ginger or the sedges that I mentioned. Wild geranium is one that a lot of people are familiar with. And while I'm on this slide, I'll also mention that most of the plant species that we have in the garden, there are 54 in total. About 50 of them are true straight native Illinois species. That's something that I really wanted to strive for. I don't really have anything against using a couple of cultivars, but that's not a conversation that we need to have today. So to talk about a couple of these ground cover species, Pennsylvania sedge is one of the most widely available sedges that you can get on the native plant ground cover market. And I can tell you from our experience at the Red Oak Rain Garden, this is an outstanding ground cover species. It stays standing through most of the year. It has some semi-evergreen tendencies, and it's lush for at least 75% of the year. It's really very, very beautiful. The fine texture is really nice as well. Here's the wild geranium that I mentioned. So you can have some really beautiful blooms in this layer as well. One of the showiest plants in the Red Oak Rain Garden, and probably one of my favorite native plants, just based on its performance at the Rain Garden, is purple poppy mallow. This display starts right around this time of the year, and it will stay showy for a full 5 to 6 weeks. And we will still have blooms on this well into August as well. A really fantastic ground cover species. It can be a little bit more on the aggressive side. So we tend to plant this as a mass planting, and we don't really interplant anything else into it. And that gets into the other layers that I will talk about in just a moment. The last ground cover that I want to talk about is one that I think a lot of us as gardeners are familiar with. This is a heuchera. This is prairie alum root, the straight Illinois native species. I think this is a really underused native plant in the home landscape. It's got beautiful broadleaf, dark green foliage that turns to really wonderful shades of red in the fall. Just an outstanding ground cover plant to pair with some of your other finer textured species. The next layer that I'll talk about today is the structural layer. And this is basically going to be the opposite of what I just covered in the ground cover layer. So you can see in this image, they're going to be your taller plants, deeper root systems. They're also more sporadically placed and fewer in number. So these plants form the backbone of the garden. Usually you'll find your shrubs, your trees, of course, some tall forbs, tall grass plants, and even some plants that stand through winter. These are all plants that can be included in the structural layer. And again, you're typically going to find these in individual or just small groupings instead of having large masses of these larger plants. Here's our selection of structural plants. And of course, there's a lot of our shrubs are in this, from our viburnums to the winterberry that we have in the shade underneath the sycamore and red oak trees. But we also have some of our taller sort of iconic prairie plants like compass plants that can grow to be 7 or even 8 feet tall. So here is one of those structural plants. This is rosinweed, a close relative of compass plant that I just mentioned. It's got these tall spires of really wonderful flowers. And you can see just as these two stalks stand strong, if there were to be 70 of these, you would sort of lose the impact that these kinds of tall, slender plants can have. I can't give a presentation without talking about one of my favorite shrubs. This is red chokeberry, which is really a true 4-season shrub that goes nicely in the structural layer. There are some cultivars of this one that are fairly easy to find at local nurseries, but this is at the Red Oak Rain Garden just a straight native species. In the spring, it's got these beautiful white flowers. In the summer, it starts to bring on its fruit, really beautiful glossy foliage as well. And then really the show happens in fall with this one. Really amazing foliage. Of course, its namesake, those red berries. Beautiful, beautiful plant. Into the winter months. And fresh snow on top of that with red berries, as I'm sure most of us know, is very photogenic and fun to look at. And from my own experience in February, I was able to watch a flock of returning robins just devour all of the berries that were left in February. Just red chokeberry is a plant that I recommend to just about anyone who has a full sun condition with average soil moisture conditions. The third layer that I'll talk about today is probably my favorite of the layers that I'm talking about. This is the seasonal layer, and this is basically what's going to fill in the gaps between the ground cover layer that covers most of the ground and then your structural layers that kind of shoot up from the garden. So this layer is made of species that are visually dominant for a period of time. And a lot of them are going to be plants that more people are familiar with, such as coneflower, black-eyed Susan. Those are two very, very popular native plants that fall into this seasonal layer. You can have a really big impact when you design in larger groups and masses of these plants. So instead of planting, 1 or 2, you're going to be planting 5 to 8, or in the case of a 10,000 square foot rain garden, you might be putting in 50 or 200 in one location to really make a strong visual impact. And it's fun because me being the plant nerd that I am, I got to use a lot of plants. So here is our seasonal layer species. And again, these can all be found on our website as well, but I'll just point out a couple of them. We've got some milkweeds in here. One of my favorites, royal catchfly, which I believe I have a photo of later in the presentation. We've also got our asters that fall into this layer as well. Here's the black-eyed Susan. The royal catchfly that I was talking about, this is actually an Illinois endangered species. So I'm really happy to have this one in the garden. Yellow coneflower, gray-headed coneflower, some people call it. Our purple coneflower, of course. And another one of my personal favorites, especially being on the University of Illinois campus, where orange is the color to be, butterfly weed, which has just started blooming again beautifully for the summer. The final layer that I want to talk about today is not necessarily included in the Planting in a Post-Wild World book, but one that I think is deserving of its own layer for a couple of reasons, and that is the ephemeral layer. So this is going to be a layer that is made of species that come up early in the spring. They sort of do their thing, they bloom, and then they go dormant for the summer months. In other words, they almost disappear, which means that you need to have species of especially ground covers that fill in the voids that those plants that quote unquote disappear leave behind through the summer months. So plants in this layer include Virginia bluebells, which I'm sure most of us are familiar with. And I just mentioned being on the University of Illinois campus, we had to have orange, but our other color is blue. So this spring, we had our first year of orange tulips and Virginia bluebells blooming together. Both of these plants are in this ephemeral layer and performed really nicely. And you can just see the sedges in here starting to peak up. And at this point here in mid-June, you can't tell that the bluebells were ever there. The sedges have filled in the gaps that were left behind. Shooting star is another plant that I think is kind of underused in the home landscape. Just an outstanding bloom on this plant, and it stays beautiful for several weeks in late spring. So I'm quickly going to go through the other sort of design concept that we had to think about at the Red Oak Rain Garden. So we were thinking about all of those layers that I just talked about, but then we had to add in the third dimension of the rain garden, and that is the bowl shape that makes the rain garden a rain garden. So we've got a basin planting zone, we've got a slope planting zone, and then we have the banks. So of course, in the basin of the garden, that's our wettest spot, right? Being at the lowest elevation, typically water, if it does stand, is going to last less than 24 hours. Since 2019, we haven't had a lot of big rainstorms in Champaign, but the few that we have had, I can tell you that the water has disappeared in much less than 24 hours. It's actually really fun to watch the water go down. But some of the plants in here can be adapted to withstand up to 12 inches of standing water for a prolonged period of time. And those include species like common rush and blue flag iris. So here they were just after one of our rainstorms in last spring. They had not yet bloomed at this point. I am happy to say that as of this spring, they have bloomed. So there's 1 year of difference between those two species. And then of course, we can have species like swamp milkweed in these kinds of conditions as well. Our slope planting zone is the next step up from the basin. So in heavy rain events, you might get some flooding in these areas, but it would typically last for just a very short period of time. So the plants in this zone had to be adapted to more average soil conditions, but could also tolerate some of those short periods of flooding, say 3 hours or less of standing water. So species like black-eyed Susan or purple coneflower fit into those slope zones as well. And then finally, the third planting zone, your banks, the highest location in the rain gardens, and therefore the driest locations. So your plants up there need to be adapted for more of your average to even dry soil conditions. And Illinois has some wonderful native plants for those, including butterfly weed and pale purple coneflower. And I think I'm going to toss it back over to Eliana for some engagement lessons.
There we go. Thank you, Layne. Okay, so these engagement lessons are ones that we learned while doing some outreach and education while designing the garden. So the first is the stakeholder partners. Here a second. There we go. The first thing that we did back in 2016 when we just first started embarking on the design was hold 2 stakeholder input sessions to find out what campus and community would be wanting to see in this location. And you can see these are what the results of those stakeholder sessions were. And these have really served as a guideposts for how we, the things that we do at the garden and the way that the garden was designed. I also want to mention that we had a number of partnerships, many of them listed here, including some of the incredible nurseries that we worked with, some support we had from the Audubon Society, CCDC, Illinois Clean Energy Community Foundation has been an incredible partner, donor, funder for us. We also had individual donors. Of course, we could not have done this without the Champaign County Master Gardeners and East Central Illinois Master Naturalists and a lot of campus units. The campus units are a really good segue to talk about inviting service learning. So in building the garden, service learning is a way of engaging people that are here to learn about native plants, learn about even just planting a plant. These students are Horticulture 100 students that Layne is shown in this picture, just talking to them about the project and showing many of them for the first time how to even plant a plant. So we get a wonderful workforce of an influx of help when we needed to plant all of those 9,000 some plants, and they get in return the training provided by a known plant nerd, and of course by their instructor as well. And this also goes for our community volunteers. So here Layne is showing many of our, I think these are all master naturalists that were at the garden just a few weeks ago, talking to them about what kind of plants that they would want to keep and what is actually an invasive plant, like the one that he's holding in his hand. So the student volunteers also, as I mentioned, have the benefit of their instructors that were there side by side during the planting. So we had students from horticulture, landscape architecture, a couple of horticulture classes. But then our community volunteers as well, having some of the extra knowledge from our local extension educator, Ryan Pankow. He's our horticulture educator that was with us on site to do a little bit of support for the red oak tree. And that's what we're all pointing at and being very happy around because Ryan was there to do an extra mycorrhizal inoculant around the tree to help support it. Just one of the things I'd like to mention about this large project that I find enriching is having students working side by side with community members. At one time, we had 4, maybe even 5 generations working at the garden. And And that just, it just doesn't happen very often to have that intermingling of ages, and that intergenerational learning is very important. If you'd like to know the secret for keeping everybody happy when you have intergenerational learning, we found out. Layne, would you like to tell them?
So I'm not sure if anyone is familiar with the Marvel movies. Oh gosh, the name is escaping me.
It's the Guardians of the
Guardians of the Galaxy.
Galaxy.
Yeah, the Guardians of the Galaxy has an incredible playlist with a lot of 70s and 80s hits. And they're songs that my generation, and yes, those below me as well, really appreciate. And so we were all singing at the top of our lungs as we were planting these plants, which I'm sure was a very interesting sight for those passing by. But it was really amazing to interact with so many generations, this wonderful project together. With that music almost being a central, sort of joining factor between all of us.
So here are some of those horticulture students doing the first bit of planting. The next slide focuses on the planting grid, and just to give a little extra information on how Layne really accomplished that. One of the key things that you see here, actually, Layne, maybe you could talk about it, but that's the yardstick.
Yeah, so since this was such a large project that was reliant on volunteers to maintain it, one of the planting methods that went into this is to actually, I'm going to click on this. Can you see my cursor moving?
Yes.
Okay, great. So we wanted to plant everything basically on a grid, and this yardstick helped us do that across the entire 10,000 square feet. So it's a lot of holes to dig, but we actually have a slide on that you'll see the magic trick behind that. But by planting in this grid, it helped us to work with the volunteers who are learning the native plants that are in here. A lot of times as our native plants are coming up, there are other weeds that look similar to them. So basically, if there was a plant that was on this grid, more than likely it was a plant that needed to stay. But say you had a plant that came up here where my cursor is at, that was probably going to be a weed. And so a volunteer would be able to identify that fairly easily and get that pulled. And it works really nicely.
So Layne, as you were talking about, there you are with the magic trick.
Perfect. Yes, I knew that there was a picture of me and my bandana in here somewhere.
Yeah. So the drill, using this drill, and is it a half-inch drill? I can't remember.
So it's a battery powered drill with a handle attachment. You can see my left hand on that handle. And then the bit that I was using was a 3-inch auger, is what it's called.
Okay.
We were installing all of these plants, for the most part, were plugs, which are very small. But the 3-inch auger bit was really just perfect for the size of plugs that we were installing here. And it was a lifesaver. There were something like 9,000 holes drilled in just a couple of days, and this drill did most of the work.
I couldn't remember the size of it. I do remember I was the guardian of it for a while after we just purchased it, and that bit was about $20, so it's not terribly expensive, but kind of expensive, right? And our office is on a second floor. There was a tornado drill. I grabbed my computer and that drill bit and went down to the basement to just, I think I'd grabbed the drill bit first and then the computer. But I'll go on with the presentation because Layne drilled as many holes as he could. And then all of those students came. So it took you, I don't know how long to drill all the holes. And they were able to plant those plants probably in 15 minutes. They were all done. Of course, they had the rest of their class period there. So I think you were scurrying around trying to drill more plants, but that became kind of a limiting factor. And so we had to bring in some reinforcements. The other three gentlemen joined Layne as the drill team. And then as the project went on, I even brought in one of our conservation biologists as a backup who brought his own drill. So there was a lot of holes that had to go in because this is such a large garden, and it took a village for that. So our last lesson that we're going to talk about is to remember to have fun and to celebrate success. This kind of project like this is so big, and it was this one was over several weeks. If you go to our website on our blog, we did in real time document everything that was happening. And although I think we were really happy with how things turned out, there were a few stumbling blocks, so that's all in there too. You can read the chills and thrills that are in there. But at the very end of it, this is the picture. I think this is like right after you and I and the two volunteers that were with us planted the last plant. And I, of course, had injured my hand. So we were very, very happy to have the last plant in. We were so happy that we decided that it was time to have a soft opening. Around that time, we also found out that the two trees were at least 100 years old. We actually subsequently have found out that they were closer to maybe 200 years old, but at the time, we thought that they were at least 100 years old. So we had a soft opening party / tree birthday, and we had a number of people on campus join us. We had talks, we had tours, and we had cake. These particular cakes are interesting because they are made with some of the ingredients that are from the plants in the garden. This particular one on the left, the flour is actually made with the acorn from the red oak. The one on the right is has spice bush in it. I think we had aronia also in this one on the left, come to think of it. Yeah, so some of the chokeberry was in this as well. And they were delicious. So then, of course, the spring of 2020 happened, and we all had to start adjusting to Zoom life. But, the garden kept going. The first year of our rain garden, the first year of any native plant garden is really critical, of course, since the plants are doing their amazing job of putting forth those incredible root systems, which we value. One of the reasons we value them so much. But that means we need to have extra care to keep the weeds out of them. So that was quite a challenge, but these plants that we put in were so amazing, and many of them bloomed the first year, and we had this incredible crop of these monarch caterpillars. So I think, Layne, can you tell the story? I don't remember now how I believe you put the Zoom meeting together.
Oh, well, I mean, it seemed fitting. We all in human society had to figure out how to use Zoom. It just seemed fitting that the monarch caterpillars needed to come along for the ride. And we had a lot of them, and of course they needed to stay in communication with each other. So Zoom was their best alternative, and so we've got Paul Monarch Cartney in there, and
Monarch J Fox. That's another
Monarch
good
J
one.
Fox. Yeah. So
there's some good ones.
we do like to have fun.
through the fall semester, we had our first student team, and you can see we're all well massed at that point. This is fall of 2020. The students on our left are actually on the right too, are doing some infiltration tests. These students also ran our social media under the guidance of Layne and Kate Gardner, and they just did a really amazing job. They did this work for us for school credit, and I believe they all got A's. They certainly deserve them. So we now have a student team. Our student here on the left, Sandra Berja, is here pictured this spring. This is during the first cleanup, I believe, of the year, where we were able to have our volunteers come back into the garden. I'm going to talk for a little moment about some of the art that has been integrated into the garden. There are these incredible mosaics. We are next door to a dormitory that has classes in it, including these art classes, and instructor Catherine Riesner worked with her students to create the mosaics that are about a 12-inch by 12-inch, and those are installed around the perimeter of the garden now, and featuring many of the plants in the garden, and of course some of the wildlife it supports. So during the pandemic in the fall, when the students came back, we did have a socially distant scavenger hunt, which featured some of those mosaics. The other thing I'm just going to point out here is that we have a CocoRa's rain gauge, and that means that we are part of a national network that is monitoring rainfall. The two items that are over here are leaf presses that were put into the sidewalk. One of them is the sycamore, and one of them is the red oak. Layne, would you like to talk about the bloom calendar?
Sure. So this was something that I put together at the end of last year in December, I believe. Throughout the year, we had been keeping track of the start and end dates of all of our blooming species in the garden. And so at the end of the year, it was really fun to go in and track this and get it into a visual graphic that could be used for different things, including this presentation. One thing that I'm really looking forward to is continuing this into future years to see how some of these species are changing over time. Whether that is as climate shifts or as species mature and their bloom times shift, something to look forward to as far as data collection goes into the future. And there are also some new species to add to this since last year as well. Looking forward to that.
This is something that I've started doing at my own home garden. So kind of in conclusion here, here's our lessons. Choose your site carefully. That water ponding under trees could be a challenge, but maybe that's a challenge that you're willing to step up to. Consider the foot traffic. Designing with maintenance in mind, very important. For the volunteers and engagement, our stakeholder partners are very important. Service learning is fantastic if that's something that you can utilize for your projects. And then never forget to have fun and celebrate your successes. Layne, I think this last part is for you to talk about the resources.
Yeah, so we have just a couple of slides coming up here that go over some of the resources that our team has put together. And actually, I'm going to go ahead and put all of the resources that I'm going to talk about into the chat box now. There you go. Okay. So 3 of the brochures that have been inspired by the Red Oak Rain Garden and are currently available include Illinois Native Plants for the Home Landscape, which is basically a collection of plants that are well suited for a home landscape setting. A lot of them can be found in the Red Oak Rain Garden. And I'll also mention that all of these brochures have attribute tables. So all of the conditions that the plants need to thrive in, the different attractions that they bring with them, such as bird attraction or bee attraction. And I'll show an example of what the inside of these brochures looks like in just a moment. The second brochure here is a full sun pollinator garden. And then of course we have a full sun rain garden as well that was inspired by our very own red oak rain garden. I'm going to go over the rain garden brochure, and this is going to be very similar to the same template that most of the other brochures use. So the front page, this is a rendering of what these gardens could look like. This is not a real photo, but this is something that I put together based on the planting selection and planting scheme within them. Inside of the brochure, you'll find a planting selection as well as a planting plan. Here's that attribute table that I was talking about that includes its sun conditions, moisture, size, some of its more soil or ecosystem conditions, and of course all the things that it supports and its drought tolerance as well. Also important to remember to have a garden that has 4-season interest. So each of these gardens are designed with those the 4-seasonality interest included, sort of built in to these garden designs. And then the back page has some selections for smaller groupings of some of the plants that are included, different combinations that you can use, where they can be found or are best suited for planting within a rain garden, as again, all of these brochures are inspired by the red oak rain garden. And then a lot of people ask for where to find the plants that are included in these brochures. So there's a nice little paragraph that directs people on how to find those as well. This spring, we released a native spring ephemeral brochure. So this highlights a lot of the ephemerals that we have here in Illinois that can be used within sort of supplementary to the brochures. And coming very soon, hopefully within just the next couple of weeks, we have a woodland suite of brochures coming out, including wet woodland, dry woodland, your standard woodland, and one that's not included on here that we've called woodland border, which is a little bit more like your part shade conditions. So really wonderful selections of native plants in these as well, hopefully coming up very, very quickly. And Eliana, do you want to talk about stormwater at home?
Sure. Just to mention to everyone that we have put together a video series of green infrastructure on a residential scale. These videos first talk about why it's important, and then it goes through from rain barrels, rain gardens, permeable pavement onto green roof, and then a few things that anybody could do is that just some general good water quality tips. Have to make sure that we get our water quality statement in there. So I think that was listed, the link to this is listed in the series of links that Layne put into the chat box. So please feel free to check those out. And that's it. I mean, apart from Q&A, but I think we really want to take this time to thank all of you for spending your Monday evening with us. It's been a real pleasure to talk to this group. The wild ones are, you all are kind of one of my favorite groups in this area, and I have had my own backyard has had the benefit of your incredible plant sale. So thank you so much for inviting us and for your time this evening. I guess if there are any questions, we'd love to take them.
And I was just going to add that I love following all of the Wild Ones social media accounts. And with that in mind, I'm also going to put in all of Red Oak Rain Garden's social media accounts. We have Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. So if you want to follow us for some of the information that we covered today, we post quite a bit of interesting content that we hope you'd enjoy. So there are links to our social media. And I will also add one last little plug in here. We also have a monthly e-newsletter that you can sign up for if you so wish. If you want to subscribe, here is a link for that. And as Eliana said, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much, and looking forward to the question and answers.
Thank you, Eliana and Layne, for this incredible presentation. I'm so impressed with this rain garden. I feel a little bit embarrassed about what my yard looks like. We do have a few questions coming in, and just a reminder to everyone attending to put any questions you have in chat. We are not unmuting people to take questions. So our first question is from Sherry, and she is wondering if all of the layers were planted at the same time.
That's a really great question, and one that we actually sort of adapted as we were going. As the landscape designer, my hope was to get all of the ground covers installed first, and then come in with the structural layer and then the seasonal layer. We started off that way, but I can tell you that it didn't work all that well, and we had to adapt. By planting all of the ground covers first, we actually made it to the point where it was difficult to move around because they were so densely planted. So we ended up, actually, Eliana, this might be a chore, but is there a way you could go back to the slide that has the grid shown? And I could explain the 20 by 20 squares that we.
That is not a chore at all. I will have to come.
While you're doing it, I will explain. So the way that we adapted is we created a 20 by 20 grid that I made on the computer. And then we basically translated what was made digitally onto the actual site. So we, so if you go to presentation on this one, yes. So basically, see these fence posts that we have in the ground here. We placed those at 20-foot intervals and made squares. And then we translated what was on a piece of paper onto the ground. And it sounds very complicated. And if I had one extra additional image, it would be easier to explain. But basically, we would come in. So these are all holes for the ground cover.
I know what image you need. Hold on a moment.
Okay.
Well, it's not that.
It's
not that great.
Question.
I have the picture of them I have the picture of the master naturalist actually holding the plan, but I just remembered that you can't actually see what they're holding. So I'll let you continue.
I really appreciate the question because it's one that that I struggled with myself, and therefore it is a great lesson learned. It's a little bit difficult to explain, but basically we ended up doing, instead of doing all of the ground covers in just this square at one time, we basically did everything at once, but broken down into more manageable 20 by 20 squares, which made it easier for us to navigate, sort of in and then around these spaces as we planted the dense planting. I hope that gives you somewhat of an answer.
Thank you, Layne. Pat is wondering if how were you able to control rabbits?
That assumes that we're controlling them.
Right.
We're not.
Yeah. So we had some issues with rabbits, especially with our asters. We used smooth blue aster. That I grew from seed, so I was very sad to see those get mowed down to the ground. I can tell you, and this is again from personal experience, with the dense planting that we have quite a few rabbits, and in some ways that's a bad thing because of the damage that they do, but in some ways it's also a good thing because the larger number of rabbits has attracted a larger number of predatory birds, such as red-tailed hawks.
And the fox.
And
I think I'm
oh,
having
yes.
feedback.
Yeah.
Hold on.
So it has been interesting being in the garden and seeing the wonders of nature happen before your eyes. Nature's own control of rabbits being the hawks. There are a couple of plants that we will put mesh over or around just to try to protect, especially when some of our plants are in bloom that rabbits tend to really enjoy. But yeah, sometimes it's pretty difficult to control all of them. I like to think that that nature will find a way to help us.
That's good advice. Kathy is wondering about some of the different planting zones that you created. How did you know which plant water requirements go into which zone?
Mm-hmm. So a lot of our native plants are adapted specifically for certain conditions. So Eliana, I see you're scrolling there.
Let me come up to the one that has this one. Yeah.
Sure. So in locations that receive a lot of water, like in our basin, for example, we are looking more towards wet prairie native plants. And there are really amazing resources out there for lists of species that can withstand certain amounts of inundation from water for extended periods of time. And yeah, the common rush and the southern blue flag iris, these plants here are two of those really wonderful species that can tolerate those conditions. And really the same goes for the other locations as well. You know, you're in your slope and on your banks. Again, I really like to use native species. So I tend to gravitate towards using a website like Illinois Wildflowers, which I assume a lot of you are probably familiar with, but maybe not everyone. Illinois Wildflowers is a wonderful resource for learning more about native plants. Very, very detailed descriptions of, I mean, hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of plants. And thank you for putting that in the chat box there, that link. I used that a lot when figuring out what plants should go in what locations within the garden.
And I will just add that, I think I'm getting some terrible feedback. I'm not sure why. That combination of the juncus and blue flag iris, I have now planted that where my air conditioner condensate comes out. You know, there's always like that wet place in your yard where that air conditioner condensate comes out, and it is really flourishing there. It's been the blue flag. I probably had about 15 blooms just in that one location. So knowing that I did that because I knew that it was working well at the base, that lower basin part of the rain garden. So I knew that it liked that wet area. So using those resources, knowing what the plant likes, just really understanding that you need to put we say it all the time in extension, the right plant in the right place.
Yeah, that's a really good advice. I know for many of us, trial and error seems to be what works with some of the plants. We want to go a certain place, but we're not really meant to go there. Mm-hmm. So I have a question. You had mentioned a couple of the plants that you put into the rain garden tend to be a little bit on the aggressive side. How do you plan for controlling, again, not that we really control nature at all, but what plants do you have in place to make sure that one plant doesn't necessarily take over a specific area.
Sure. So I think I was talking about purple poppy mallow when I was bringing that up, but I saw this yellow coneflower, gray-headed coneflower, whichever you prefer, and this actually probably paints a better picture. So this is a species that is notorious for reseeding successfully, but it is a beautiful native plant, and so I really wanted to try this one out in the garden. And the way that I combated some of the tendencies that this one has to reseed itself is by putting it on the eastern edge of the garden. And when I mean the edge, I mean right along the border between where the garden is, and then there is a large mown area. Actually, I can probably just find the map so I can better explain that. They are located right in this area of the garden. And so the idea is that as prevailing winds come through, most of that seed is going to be throughout the winter months dispersed into the area that is already mown, which lessens the number of seeds, of course, that you're going to have successfully germinating in portions of the garden that you don't want that plant to be in. In our third year of growth there at the garden, it's been successful so far. And I hope that continues, because it really is a beautiful species that is showy for several months of the year, especially when our students are just coming back to school there in August. So again, fingers crossed for that one, but that is one of those more aggressive species that has to be placed in a pretty thoughtful location. The other species that I mentioned first of all is this purple poppy mallow. And the way that I combat the aggressiveness of this plant is by simply not planting anything else within it. I gave this plant plenty of room to grow. It spreads out. Some of the arms on this plant could be up to 10 feet long, I've seen in the garden. And in our amount of space, it works really well. It's also important to remember that we were using many dozens of plants. Most average home gardeners are only going to be installing a small handful of these, which is going to really reduce how aggressive this plant really is. We also have, you can see actually pretty well in the background of this picture, a plant that is almost equally as, I'm not going to call it aggressive because it doesn't spread, but as dense as this purple poppy mallow. This is called Emery's sedge. This is in the basin of the sunny area of the rain garden. And the height plus the density of this plant prevents the purple poppy mallow from encroaching into that mass of planting. So it's pretty well contained by a species that can counteract its aggressive tendencies.
Thank you. That looks like that is the end of our questions for the evening. Right now it looks like our questions are done. So again, want to thank Eliana and Layne for this incredible presentation. It was so informative. I know I have some ideas now in terms of some things that I want to do in my yard. I can't wait to get to the U of I campus to see the rain garden, to take a look at it. And we so appreciate the work that you're doing, your promotion of native plants, also helping with water quality, which is also very important, something that natives can help with. So thank you again so much for your time and your sharing your knowledge.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Kathy. Thank you,
Thank you
everyone.
so much for having us.
Have a great night, everyone.
Bye.